An American ferry in Havana Harbor. The first ship from the United States in almost half a century. At almost the same time, U.S. President Barack Obama reaches the small island nation.
And it's a historic opportunity to engage directly with the Cuban people and to forge new agreements and commercial deals, to build new ties between our two peoples, and for me to lay out my vision for a future that's brighter than our past.
The president wants a fresh start, but some of the Cuban population remains skeptical.
The superpower is our enemy. Even if it's wearing sheep's clothing now, it's still our enemy.
The ship brings tourists from the United States to Cuba, but the sight also awakens the memory of a time more than 60 years ago in the viewers. Back then, warships circled the island threateningly. An attack by the United States was imminent.
The United States are behind all activities directed against Cuba.
Intelligence services are suspected by Cubans of having carried out covert operations against their country for many years. Bombings, even bacterial warfare.
I grew up without a father and became part of this big family who were all victims of terrorism.
Starting in 1961, there was a veritable mass exodus from Cuba.
My brother left Cuba on one of these flights of freedom. I said goodbye to him together with my parents. My poor brother was 7 years old, and I saw how he was struggling not to cry. He had glassy eyes and held back his tears.
Over 14,000 Cuban children have left their families by a secret route. The operation, known as Peter Pan, leaves a part of Cuban society with traumatic memories. Cubans have to date been unable to unequivocally prove allegations of involvement by the United States. Nevertheless, the accusation continues to this day to influence its picture of history and its relationship with the United States.
I just could not understand how my parents were able to say goodbye to my brother. He was still so small and vulnerable. My parents were so loving and good, responsible parents, which is why I simply could not understand it. I began to investigate everything that had to do with Operation Peter Pan because I wanted to understand, especially understand my parents.
Marina Ochoa spent her childhood in pre-revolutionary Cuba.
My family was part of the upper middle class. My father was a judge and owned several homes. I was a spoiled child, like everyone in my class.
Mimada, como todas las de mi clase, la burguesía de Holguín era una burguesía que procedía.
The attitude of my family was shaped by their wealth.
Y la idiosincrasia era de ese mismo tipo, o sea, era racista,
they were racist, sexist, white, and very reactionary.
Blanca y muy reaccionaria.
Cuba was originally a Spanish colony. It didn't have any gold or silver, but it became the transshipment point where Spanish ships from the rest of the Americas would come together in order to cross the Atlantic. And so it became a shipping center, and strategically was very important. In the 19th century, Cuba became the world's foremost producer of sugar, and the whole Cuban economy became focused around the production of this one commodity.
American warships in Havana's harbor, 1940. The United States saw itself as liberators of Cuba from Spanish domination and wanted to expand their economic influence in Cuba in addition to their military presence.
El modo de vida norteamericano prácticamente lo había asumido.
The American way of life went over to the ruling class. I went to a North American school. At the time, there was no anti-American sentiment in my social circle.
At the time, American companies in Cuba had a lot of influence on relations between the two countries. The price of wood, sugar, and tobacco was dictated by the companies. Fulgencio Batista had been the leading power in Cuba for over 2 decades. At first a ray of hope for the poor, he later goes down in history as a brutal dictator. Supported by the United States, Batista was responsible for corruption, persecution, and nepotism. He stuffed his own pockets with millions. Carmen Valdivia has lived in Miami for many years. She was born in Batista's time. The boxes we see are from her last exhibition on Operation Peter Pan.
This is, we used to have once a year, we used to have these parties, and they would have these dresses custom made. I mean, the shoes, you would go to a shoe place where they would make the shoes custom for you. They were red. Then this is me here and my sister. Okay. And this cousin is in Puerto Rico, so I see him all. And this is my family, my grandmother and my aunts and uncles that I never saw again.
At the time, the island was one of the more developed countries of Latin America. But it was a bad time for the ordinary workers and their families. They had neither sufficient education nor a good income. In the early 50s, there was an uprising of the people against Batista. The leader of the revolution was a descendant of Spanish immigrants, Fidel Castro, the declared opponent of the rich in the country. He built an army of volunteers who were preparing to overthrow the government. In the underground, the charismatic leader Castro became a figure of hope, especially among the rural population.
La Revolución Cubana puso fin a una relación.
The Cuban Revolution ended a very close relationship between the Cuban oligarchy that ruled the country and the North American transnational companies that they served. This Cuban upper class imagined it was part of America.
In 1959, the dictator Batista was overthrown, and Fidel Castro came to power. His triumph initially triggered great enthusiasm amongst the population. Most people did not anticipate the radical changes that were to come under Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro wanted to free Cuba from the dominance of the United States and to radically change Cuba's social order.
Castro's revolutionary court began cracking down on opponents of the new regime. Landowners were expropriated, and after numerous show processes, many opponents went to jail.
It was a short-lived happiness because in February, they started with the executions and the summary trials. And my father went wild when he saw the trials on television, and it was like the Coliseum, you know, and he said, we're going back to the circus and the Coliseum. You can do that. Even though he was against these people because they were from Batista and he was against Batista, but they were human beings, and you cannot just try them and then people would go paredon and the executions were played on TV. And it was just, I used to, we were very Americanized. We would watch Rin Tin Tin and all kinds of American programs, and all of a sudden we were watching executions.
The mood in Cuba changed due to the brutal purges. Those who did business with the United States before the revolution now feared for their existence due to the anti-American sentiment.
And so in 1959 and 1960, you had this breakdown of the revolutionary coalition. And Castro at some point decided that socialism and an alliance with the Soviet Union was the only way he could achieve the goals that he had in mind for Cuba.
Castro promised to fairly redistribute wealth, to improve care and education. Socialism was supposed to fundamentally change life for everyone, an ideal for which not all the revolutionaries had fought.
One day, we decided that we had to fight against the regime because our friends, that had died for the revolution did not die for a communist revolution at all.
After the revolution, property was nationalized. Landowners were expropriated. Americans had to sell their property to Cuba. Children were sworn into the new nationalist spirit.
Había muchos intereses en Cuba de los norteamericanos.
The U.S. had enormous economic interests in Cuba.
Económicas,
There were real financial losses for the Americans.
de propiedades.
But the revolution was important because the population was starving and illiteracy levels were high. The people who had died for the revolution wanted to change this.
Ofrendaron 20,000 muertos.
So by definition, the revolution had to be anti-American. As soon as the Americans understood that, and it was only a few months after the revolution, they said, we have to get rid of Fidel. We have to get rid of the revolution. And the only way we can do it is to make it official policy. And the CIA and the State Department came out with statements saying, here is how we are going to end the revolution. We are going to impose an embargo.
The embargo of the superpower had far-reaching consequences for the small island. Trade agreements were overridden. American refineries were closed. Cuba would starve. The aim was to mobilize the Cuban population against Castro, but the insurgency didn't happen. The United States also had a plan to invade. The military action was intended to overthrow the Cuban government with the help of Cuban exiles. In the history of both countries, this is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Well, during the Bay of Pigs, we were part of the groups that went in ahead of the invasion to work with the internal resistance, and that's what we concentrated in at the time. So we participated in passing intelligence to the United States and working with the resistance internally. Unfortunately, we all know the failure of the Bay of Pigs, the lack of support that we got.
Brigade fought with tremendous courage, but they ran out of ammunition because all the ammunition they had was those that they landed with. They fought for 3 days like lions.
The invasion failed. The attack from the sea was not able to retreat. Castro had an easy time of it. The invading forces lost, having to fend for themselves.
When that failed, the CIA continued with paramilitary attacks, but they were more aimed at sabotage, at damaging the Cuban economy, because it was clear that the only way to overthrow the Cuban government by direct military force would be a U.S. invasion, and President Kennedy was not willing to do that.
The world was now watching how Cuba allied with the Soviet Union, and Russian nuclear missiles were stationed in Cuba. Negotiations between Russia and the United States prevented a Third World War. At a press conference in 1962, President John F. Kennedy announced the withdrawal of Russian medium-range missiles. The CIA made contact with Cubans who opposed a socialist Cuba. By 1960, the Americans had decided to take the fight against Fidel Castro underground. The beginning of an incredible operation.
I think Operation Pedro Pan begins as a program to get the children of the underground out of Cuba. That is, people who had initially supported the revolution and then for a series of reasons, including the lack of democracy and elections and the repression, felt that they had to make another revolution. And they wanted to be able to fight without having to worry about their children.
The children of Castro's opponents also arrive in Miami with the help of the United States government. The feeling in Cuba later is that the U.S. only supported those who needed help for one reason. Cuba will be discredited by the emigration of the Peter Pan children. The initiative was carried out solely as a propaganda stunt.
The revolution closed all schools for restructuring. And for 8 months, there were no schools, public or private. And so they rewrote the books and everything else. They changed history, rewrote the books, and opened the schools again after 8 months. And then they had to teach Leninist, Marxist indoctrination.
The idea of a socialist people was taught in schools, and Castro's promise was true: education for everyone.
Compañeros visitantes, el Círculo Provincial de Pioneros. Comrade visitors, the Camagüey Pioneer Camp Camilo Cienfuegos welcomes you most cordially. We wish that you have a pleasant time among us. Pioneers for communism, we will be like Che.
The repression in Cuba becomes very, very intense. Parents become afraid.
Uniéndole el cierre cerrojo en su soporte.
En realidad, la clase media cubana,
The Cuban middle class lost everything in the revolution.
Fue agredida económicamente.
The revolution also did a lot of economic damage.
Fue agredida
This is normal.
en su idiosincrasia, fue agredida en una serie de
They had to give up their habits and only had a few options for their family and their children.
Sobre su familia, sobre su descendencia.
On the other side, the U.S. government is waging a very intense war against the Cuban government, including a propaganda war, in which they are trying to create disaffection. One of their strategies was to tell Cuban parents that the government was going to take away control over their children.
The American radio station Radio Swan also spread this rumor. It was an agitation station that the CIA operated from Cuba's southern coast. It warned of the effects of communism in Cuba with targeted false reports. This propaganda was intended to provoke fear in parents for their children.
The spread of these rumors that were designed to get Cubans to send their children to the United States, and which has come to be known as Operation Peter Pan, was a conscious policy of the United States government, implemented by the Central Intelligence Agency as part of this overall plan that they had of covert operations against Cuba to try to undermine Castro's government.
It seems that with the operation of Peter Pan, humanitarian and anti-communist motives have merged. A fake law starts to circulate.
A esos efectos, por encargo de la CIA, Álvaro Fernández.
To this end, on behalf of the CIA, Álvaro Fernández wrote a fake that looked like a Cuban government paper and that was spread throughout the country.
Agents and Catholic priests are said to have distributed the fake document, in which was stated that, from the time of coming into force, the education of those under 20 years of age would be carried out by the Cuban state in the towns.
Cuban parents were absolutely terrified that this was true. And the document itself was quite official looking, and it showed that it was from Fidel Castro, and it looked really official, but it was never signed. But the parents looked at it and said, well, this must be true. And they were able to be convinced that it was better to send their children out of the country for their safety without any idea what type of life these kids were going to have in the United States.
Voluntarily or involuntarily, parents part with their children. Carmen Valdiva is one of those who was taken to the airport by her parents.
They only allowed one parent in the airport, so he decided that my mother should be the one to go to the airport with us. And so I went down, and he was in the sidewalk. He had a car waiting, a taxi waiting for my sister and for myself and my mother. And we said goodbye to him, and it's the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, was say goodbye to my father in the street.
We would then walk out to the runway, and a militia would stop you, and sometimes would take dolls away or, check the hems of dresses, etc. And if you passed that inspection, then you went on the plane. At least in my case, they tried to take my doll away, and I was very abrupt and got to keep it.
When the exodus of children began, Marina Ochoa was a student.
Empezaron a pasar cosas en la escuela.
I remember that from one day to the next, my friends no longer came to school. You never saw them again. When you called them at home, they weren't there. The number no longer existed. There was an atmosphere of fear when the children disappeared. There was also a rumor that the government had kidnapped the children and sent them to Russia.
In Russia, children are said to be put in uniforms and sent throughout the world as party soldiers, a rumor which seems to confirm the Church's fear of communism. Historian Leo Grand harbors a suspicion that, by request of the relevant authorities, has not been commented upon.
And the CIA and the Cuban Catholic Church and the US Catholic Church conspired together not only to propagate this rumor, but then to facilitate people sending their children to the United States. The Cuban Catholic Church, of course, was closely associated with Spain, and it did not have a very positive reputation among the Cuban people because in the wars of independence, the church had sided with Spain and was seen as an anti-nationalist church. The other reason that the Cuban Catholic Church was not nearly as influential as the Catholic Church in many other Latin American countries was because such a large proportion of the Cuban population were former slaves.
When the revolution came to power, there were many private schools that were run by nuns, priests, and monks. That's where the children of the rich went. In the religious schools, there were no black or mixed-race children.
After the revolution, the composition of classes changes in favor of disadvantaged children.
We have to remember this is the height of the Cold War, in which not only the US government is fighting communism, there's the communist scare of the 1950s here, but the Catholic Church itself was an institution that had felt threatened by communism, and they had, from the 1930s, doctrines about the evils of communism.
Some Catholic clergymen view communism as a diabolical threat.
And Castro was able to break the power and influence of the church by expelling all of the clerics who were not of Cuban origin, and that was actually the majority of clerics in Cuba were not Cuban, they were Spanish, and closing down the Catholic churches and creating in Cuba an atheist system.
The situation in Cuba was getting worse. Official relations between the two countries were broken off. The American embassy closed in 1961. Therefore, visas for children could not be issued. The Catholic Church then offered to help.
We learned that parents could request visas from the churches. Once the priests had issued them, the children could be sent to the United States.
The Catholic Church was commissioned by the U.S. government to issue blank checks for the children's departure. Parents trusted the church. Marina Ochoa was supposed to leave the country in this way, but she did not want to be separated from her parents. So she stayed. It was only her little brother who became a victim of the panic-stricken parents.
I could not imagine that my parents could be separated from their child. He seemed so small, so fragile. It really affected me, without really understanding the full extent at the moment. But I was aware that he would be all alone, though he was so young. He had never flown before. At the time, I thought it would be best if I went with him to protect him. He did his best not to cry, but I saw him, and it was a terrible moment.
Most of the children ended up going through the Catholic Church, and they were then initially put in camps in Miami. And as the numbers grew, they started to ship children out to orphanages all throughout the United States. In the case of about 6,000 of us, we ended up with friends and families, and that was my case. I ended up in one of my mother's cousins' home. She had recently come to the United States, and that's where I was when my parents came.
My brother wrote a few letters to my mother in which he only wrote the same words from top to bottom. Mama, come. Mama, come. From top to bottom. That says it all. It was obvious how he suffered. What child writes such a pleading letter to his mother?
Clamando por su mamá.
Many dozens of parents were in the same position as mine, who never saw their children again. Because with the currency exchange, they lost everything and could not afford the journey.
I was there for 3 years, waiting for my parents. Because I came in August of 1962, and the missile crisis was in October of 1962. And so we were on the brink of a nuclear war. My parents were in Cuba. My sister and I were here. And we were watching, the armament aimed at Cuba. And my parents were watching the armament aimed at us. And we thought we would never see each other again.
14,000 children leave their home country during this time. Only a few succeed in resuming contact with their parents immediately after their arrival.
Half the children had not been reunited by their parents. At that point, the United States is refusing to let Cubans enter. There were 3 years where Cubans were not let into the United States. For those 3 years, Cuba would not let children go back either.
In this time, a Catholic priest spoke to Cuban children in Miami, which was filmed by the United States government for propaganda purposes.
Under the sheltering skies of the United States, far from the land where you were born, there is a new society, a new world waiting ahead of you, a homeland that you have to build. And that new homeland, that new world, can only be built with new men. And that is what Cuba is waiting for from all of you.
A proposal was made that the U.S. provide funds so parents could travel to the U.S. to see their children. But the U.S. rejected the proposal.
Operation Peter Pan is now portrayed in Cuba as a propaganda coup by the American government. A biased interpretation which overlooks the humanitarian motives.
My parents and I never saw my brother again. My parents died in 1994, also from grief.
After the refugee camps were closed in the late 60s, all trace of some of the children was lost. Many questions remain open. Documents that might possibly explain the United States' involvement remain inaccessible to this day. In the aftermath of Operation Peter Pan, the relationship between the United States and Cuba remains difficult. Opponents of Fidel Castro's regime are planning new campaigns against him.
The most infamous act of terrorism against Cuba was the bombing of Cuban Airlines in October 1976. It was the first act of air terrorism in the Americas and remains the second worst act of air terrorism after 9/11. But no one knows of this. No one knows of this.
My father was an extraordinary man. Every weekend he was out and about with us. He took us to the fair or to Lennon Park. He was a pilot and was part of the Cuban crew, which didn't have many members at the time because of the circumstances. In the 70s, bad things happened. That made us cautious. When I was 10 years old, my father was a victim of 3 attacks, all of which he survived, thank God.
On October 6, 1976, Ana's father, Wilfredo Perez, made an emergency call. The pilot, Wilfredo Perez, didn't want to endanger the lives of the islanders and decided to stay over the sea until the crash. The majority of those who died were Cubans. The search for the attackers began before the funeral services were over. Shortly thereafter, 2 organizations in the United States confessed to being the perpetrators of the atrocious bombing.
The bombing of Cubana Airlines in 1976, which killed all 73 people aboard, was undertaken by 2 Cuban exiles who had been trained by the CIA as demolition experts for these paramilitary attacks in the 1960s. The CIA had stopped supporting those kind of attacks by the mid-1970s, but of course, the people that they trained didn't stop.
In Central America, shortly before the attack, an organization of exiled Cubans is established with the aim of opposing the Cuban government by force.
Who were the perpetrators? First, Orlando Bosch Avila, the leader of a well-known counter-revolutionary group in the U.S., and Luis Posada Carriles, a member of the Venezuelan intelligence service.
Whether the United States Secret Service still had contact with former agents at that time was, by request, not commented upon.
Why should a confrontation between 2 different political systems actually lead to a real war? With bombs, invasions, propaganda, mercenaries, and attacks like the one on the plane. A team of young fencers from Cuba died there. They had just won a tournament.
The Americans knew that the crime would take place. At best, they turned a blind eye and did not prevent it. But I think that the connection between them and the intelligence apparatus of the U.S. went beyond that.
Luis Posada, who admitted to attacks against Cuba, entered the U.S. unhindered in 2005.
Neither Orlando Bosch or Luis Posada Carriles were ever convicted of the bombings. In fact, Luis Posada Carriles still lives in Miami to this day. He's never been bothered, he's never been convicted, he's never been arrested for this.
In the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies in Miami, we were given an explanation for the terrorists' possible motives at that time.
We lost people during the Bay of Pigs, very close friend of ours. We saw the necessities change the thing in our homeland toward a democracy. That thing have motivated us and all the brigade members all through our life. So we felt it was a responsibility for those who died in the same endeavor that we started to liberate Cuba from communism. And of course, none of us have stopped until we see Cuba free.
In 2011, survivors of the Cuban victims asked in an American newspaper why the United States did not detain the terrorists responsible.
The only way to make our problem known, to get international help, was to inform the Americans that they were living next door to terrorists.
Lo primero, yo creo que nunca jamás en la Plaza de la Revolución.
Never before or after the plane crash had more people gathered in the square of the revolution. It was very impressive. When I arrived, there were more than 1 million people. At this moment, all of the suffering that the terrorism from Miami had brought upon us Cubans was visible.
The question of whether the CIA knew about the planned attack in advance remained unanswered.
I couldn't bury my father. The body disappeared in the bottom of the sea. We keep his memory alive. Other children also suffered. It was very painful for me. I'll never forget it.
Even at the end of the 70s, the American embassy in Cuba remains closed, and the embargo is still in force. The Cuban population still suspects the United States of planning campaigns against the country behind the scenes.
There was a time back in the 1970s during the Nixon administration when it does appear that the United States was involved in spreading in Cuba some bacterial agents that would attack crops to try to do damage to the Cuban economy.
Tobacco fields are said to have been contaminated with fungus in order to inflict significant damage on the economy, an accusation to which the United States government has not responded and which remains unproven. Ana Caminero has, however, suffered a heavy loss.
Here's a photo of her. Here she's with her sister and her cousin. At a birthday party. A few days later, she died. She woke up with a fever. That was on the 8th of July, 1981. On the 10th of July, my little girl suddenly died.
Here you can see the nurse as she cares for the children. There were very small children who were sick. A total of 101 children died.
The Cuban professor took the photos at the time. As it turned out, it was the outbreak of an epidemic. Hundreds of thousands fell ill with a mysterious virus.
We had to improvise hospitals because we didn't have enough. We had to close schools and turn them into hospitals.
Medical experts established that the disease is caused by the dengue fever type 2 virus. This virus is transmitted by mosquitoes.
Dengue fever is especially bad for children. The doctors who treated them cried and hit their head against the walls of the hospital in despair as children died. Using this type of weapon against a nation shows that there is something dirty in this society, something corrupt, something rotten.
The Cubans can provide no evidence that the United States was involved in the outbreak of the epidemic. When asked, the CIA does not comment on the assumptions. The suspicion, however, still influences the relationship between the Cubans and their neighbors.
It's been known for many years, since the Vietnam War, that the American military used aircraft to deploy biological warfare agents. That's the only possible explanation for why people who lived so far away from each other were bitten by mosquitoes and infected with dengue type 2.
According to a study commissioned by the United States military, the U.S. Army conducted research into mosquitoes as carriers of viruses in the 1950s. In the operation known as Big Buzz, insects were dropped from the air in the U.S. state of Georgia in order to test their effects. For the Cubans, this provides vital circumstantial evidence for their suspicion.
We've never had a case of dengue 2 before that. They tested all the tourists and visitors in Cuba at the time from countries that did have dengue 2. None of them carried it into Cuba. None of the Caribbean countries within the area closest to Cuba had any incidences of dengue 2. It was only Cuba, and to have so many in such a short period of time over such a specific area is almost impossible for it to occur naturally.
It is clear to Keith Bollender that it would only be possible for the disease to break out at 3 different locations simultaneously if it had been introduced from the outside. Other experts, such as those of the WHO, however, consider this assumption to be pure speculation.
They prevented the purchase of pesticides and insecticides and everything we needed to eradicate the epidemic. The epidemic continued until 1981 because we couldn't contain it in time.
After I buried my daughter, I went to the hospital and left it with my other daughter. I've kept her close ever since. There were moments when I felt such a great pain in my heart that I thought my chest would burst.
It is no longer possible to comprehend the extent to which America prevented the purchase of pesticides to contain the catastrophe. Cuba in the new millennium. There's no longer an alliance with Russia. As of 2016, the U.S. trade embargo was still in force and illegal according to the UN General Assembly. 188 countries have been advocating to repeal it for years, so far without success.
The United States began a new set of covert programs aimed at stimulating opposition to the Cuban government. Not military programs, but political programs, what the CIA used to call political action. But these were conducted through the U.S. Agency of International Development and involved providing assistance to opponents of the Cuban government, trying to stimulate opposition among the population more generally.
The apparatus is absurd, corrupt, and manipulated. You policemen make me feel sorry for you instead of angry. You're such hypocrites. You don't see that you're victims of the system. My motto is, long live free Cuba.
On April 11, 2011, a Cuban musician met with those responsible for an American government organization in Miami. Final agreements were made. The goal was to attract young people in Havana for American interests.
And so they went down and befriended a lot of the really talented Cuban musicians who were behind this great hip-hop scene. And it was like a lot of hip-hop, very politically oriented, and it had real authenticity. The music producers introduced themselves as music producers, not as agents of the U.S. government.
Un pueblo que no traiciono y un lápiz de alto calibre, un compromiso progresista que hace que me caguen todas esas putas que se venden y se hacen llamar artistas. Rápido te caes.
And I don't think at any point that I'm aware of did they tell them. But the idea was that they would give them training, bring them outside of the country, and try and amplify their message to become more political and to build a real protest movement that would threaten the government in Cuba.
The journalist Desmond Butler revealed the actions of USAID, an American government organization. But the false game of the hired music agents did not spark a counter-revolution among young Cubans and did not overthrow the state power.
It wouldn't surprise me to learn other amazing stories like the attempt to influence the hip-hop scene or to set up a secret social network in the great history of American-Cuban relations.
Little Havana, a district in the heart of Miami today. Many of the anti-Cuba campaigns at that time began here, because in addition to Cuban folklore, there is still a nucleus of Castro opponents in Florida. The Cuban community demands a high-profile crackdown against the current Cuban government and the continuation of the trade embargo.
Another calling the commander-in-chief an accomplice of...
Also in relation to the violation of human rights of which they accuse it.
There are a lot of older, hardline Cubans here who oppose Castro, oppose Obama and any opening, but there are also a lot of younger people here who say it's time.
Carmen Valdivia's crates are packed and ready for her next exhibition about Operation Peter Pan in Miami. The Cuban exile has dedicated her whole life to this topic.
I have never gone back to Cuba. I don't ever, as long as I live, want to see a miliciano. And as long as there are milicianos in the airport in Havana, I'm not going.
In Chicago, Maria Torres tried to get a court order for the release of dozens of CIA files about Peter Pan, without success.
The CIA refused to acknowledge or deny the existence of Operation Pedro Pan. My suspicion is that there were people alive that were involved and had collaborated with the CIA, and that they were protecting the names of agents, including some that I believe were living in Cuba.
One of the things President Obama said was that it didn't make sense for the United States anymore to be trying to destabilize the Cuban government because we have seen the cost of failed states. And he was referring, I think, precisely to this conceit that we have had historically, that we can go in and remold other peoples and other countries to look like us, and what we create instead are failed states.
Unfortunately, there are Peter Pan groups in Miami that do not forgive their parents, who see them as perpetrators and feel resentment. But I realized that these parents were victims just as much as the children. They were victims of this terrible, ingenious, and beyond that, even successful manipulation.
When the American ferry finally reached the port in Havana, a lot was discussed. A man with a flag spoke the loudest.
I'm for a union between the United States and Cuba. I can speak for the people. I'm one of them. The Cuban government and the Cuban people are not the same.
With calls of long live free Cuba and the applause of bystanders, the U.S. sympathizer was taken away by the police and released shortly thereafter. A new generation will determine Cuba's future.